For 4 years, I buried my past and lived like I didn't deserve happiness. Until the billionaire CEO next door asked me one question that changed everything. Ethan Cole lived a life that most people would overlook without a second glance, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Every morning before the sun had fully risen, he was already awake in his small, slightly worn house at the end of a quiet street, carefully preparing breakfast and packing a simple lunch for his 6-year-old daughter, Lily. She was the brightest part of his world, the only reason his days still carried meaning. After walking her to school, Ethan would head straight to his modest garage, where the scent of oil and metal filled the air as he spent hours fixing other people's cars. His hands were always rough, his clothes stained, and his expression calm but distant, like a man who had long ago decided not to expect anything more from life. The neighbors knew him as polite but reserved, the kind of man who nodded in greeting but never lingered for conversation. No one asked questions, and Ethan made sure there was nothing to ask. For 4 years, he had carefully built this quiet existence, one where the past stayed buried and emotions stayed controlled. He avoided anything that resembled happiness beyond Lily's laughter, because deep down, he didn't believe he deserved it. There had been a time when Ethan was different, when he smiled more easily, when dreams felt possible, but that version of him had disappeared the night everything fell apart. Now he lived with a quiet kind of discipline, keeping his world small, predictable, and safe from anything that might reopen old wounds. Evenings were always the same: dinner with Lily, helping her with homework, listening to her innocent stories about school, and tucking her into bed with a gentle promise that he would always be there. And he meant it, because she was all he had left. But even in those peaceful moments, there was a weight in his chest he could never fully shake, a silent reminder of the life he had lost and the guilt he carried with him every single day. Then, one ordinary evening, the stillness of the neighborhood was broken by something entirely unexpected. The low hum of engines grew louder as a line of sleek black SUVs rolled slowly down the street, their polished surfaces reflecting the fading sunlight. Curtains shifted as curious neighbors peeked outside, whispers spreading quickly about who could possibly be arriving in such a dramatic fashion. Ethan noticed the movement too, but only briefly. He stood by the window for a second, watching as the vehicles came to a stop in front of the long, empty house next door. A few men stepped out first, scanning the area with quiet efficiency, before opening the door for a woman who emerged with effortless confidence. She carried herself with a presence that was impossible to ignore, elegant, composed, and completely out of place in their modest neighborhood. For a fleeting moment, Ethan's eyes met the scene, and something stirred inside him, something unfamiliar and uncomfortable. But just as quickly, he turned away. Whoever she was, whatever her life looked like, it had nothing to do with him. Ethan had spent 4 years making sure of that, keeping his distance from anything that might disrupt the fragile balance he had created. And yet, as he walked away from the window, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had just changed, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. Claire Whitmore had built her life on precision, control, and an unshakable ability to read people within seconds. Yet the man living next door to her seemed to exist completely outside of that ability. From the moment she stepped out of the black SUV and into the quiet, modest neighborhood, she had felt every pair of eyes watching her, measuring her, curious about her presence, but not his. Ethan Cole had barely glanced in her direction before turning away, as if she were just another passing detail in his already occupied world. That alone was enough to intrigue her. Over the next few days, Claire found herself noticing him more than she intended. Early in the mornings, she would see him walking his daughter to school, his pace steady, his posture calm, but his face carrying a quiet heaviness that didn't match the warmth in his eyes when he looked at the little girl beside him. In the evenings, she'd catch glimpses of him returning from work, hands slightly dirty, shoulders tired, yet always making sure to greet his daughter with a soft smile before stepping inside. There was a contrast in him that didn't make sense. A man who clearly loved deeply, yet kept himself emotionally distant from everything else. Claire, who had spent years navigating high-stakes negotiations and complex human behavior, couldn't ignore it. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was something deeper, something that made her pause longer than usual when she passed by his house or glanced toward his garage as she drove past. One morning, she decided to act on it. Timing her walk carefully, she crossed paths with Ethan just as he was returning from dropping Lily at school. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm and confident, expecting at least a flicker of recognition. Ethan looked at her briefly, offering a polite nod. "Morning." That was it. No attempt to continue, no curiosity about who she was, no effort to engage further. For most people, that would have been enough to end the interaction. But Claire wasn't most people. "You've lived here long?" she asked, keeping her tone casual. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying, "A few years." His answers were short, measured, like someone carefully choosing how much of himself to reveal, which in his case wasn't much at all. Claire studied him for a moment longer, sensing the invisible wall he had built around himself. She had seen it before in different forms, people guarding secrets, hiding pain, but Ethan's was different. It wasn't defensive, it was almost resigned, as if he had already decided that no one would ever get close enough to matter. That realization lingered with her long after the conversation ended. For the first time in years, Claire found herself thinking about someone who wasn't tied to business deals, board meetings, or power dynamics. Ethan Cole didn't want anything from her, didn't try to impress her, and didn't even seem to care who she was. And somehow, that made him impossible to ignore. There was a story behind his silence, she was certain of it, and for reasons she couldn't fully explain, Claire felt drawn to uncover it, even if it meant stepping into a world completely different from her own. The storm arrived without warning, rolling in with dark clouds that swallowed the evening sky and winds that rattled windows across the quiet neighborhood. By the time the first crack of thunder echoed through the streets, the power had already begun to flicker, and within minutes, everything went completely dark. Inside her large, modern home, Claire Whitmore stood still for a moment, staring at the sudden silence around her. No lights, no hum of electronics, just the distant sound of rain pounding against the glass. It was a kind of stillness she wasn't used to, one that felt strangely unsettling. She checked her phone. No signal. For the first time in years, she felt unprepared. After a brief hesitation, her thoughts turned to the one place nearby that didn't feel entirely unfamiliar anymore. Ethan's house. Across the yard, she noticed a faint, warm glow flickering through his window. Candlelight. Taking a quiet breath, she stepped outside into the rain, making her way to his door. When she knocked, there was a brief pause before it opened, revealing Ethan standing there, slightly surprised but composed. Behind him, the soft light of candles illuminated a simple but comforting scene. Lily sitting at the table, giggling softly as she played with shadows on the wall. The warmth inside contrasted sharply with the cold storm outside. "Power's out," Claire said, almost unnecessarily. Ethan gave a small nod. "Yeah, it happens sometimes." There was no hesitation in his voice, no frustration, just quiet acceptance. After a moment, he stepped aside. "You can come in if you want." Claire entered, brushing rain from her coat, and for the first time she saw Ethan's world up close. It wasn't impressive or extravagant, but it felt real, lived in, warm, and somehow peaceful. Lily looked up with bright eyes. "Hi," she said cheerfully, as if Claire had always been part of their world. Claire smiled softly in return, something she rarely did without intention. As the rain continued to pour outside, the three of them sat together, the storm creating a strange sense of closeness. For a while they spoke lightly, simple things, safe things, but Claire couldn't ignore what she felt beneath the surface. Ethan was different here. The guarded distance she had seen before seemed thinner, almost fading in the presence of his daughter. He laughed quietly at something Lily said, and for a brief second Claire caught a glimpse of a version of him that didn't seem weighed down. It made her wonder what had taken that version away. The question lingered in her mind, growing stronger with each passing moment until she finally spoke without overthinking it. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice softer now. Ethan looked at her, slightly cautious but not closed off. "Sure." Claire held his gaze for a moment, studying the quiet tension in his expression, before asking, "Why do you act like you're not meant to be happy?" The words settled heavily in the room. Ethan didn't respond right away. His expression changed subtly, the warmth in his eyes dimming as something deeper surfaced, something guarded, something painful. The silence that followed was louder than the storm outside. For the first time, Claire realized she hadn't just asked a question, she had touched something he had been hiding for a very long time. That night, long after the storm had passed and the neighborhood lights flickered back to life, Ethan lay awake staring at the ceiling. Claire's question echoing in his mind like a crack that refused to seal. Why do you act like you're not meant to be happy? It wasn't just the words, it was the way she had looked at him, as if she had seen something he had spent years trying to hide. For 4 years, he had built his life around silence, routine, and control, carefully avoiding anything that might force him to confront the truth. But now, the memories he had buried were pushing their way back to the surface, uninvited and relentless. He closed his eyes, but it only made things worse. He could see it all again with painful clarity, the night that had changed everything. Back then, Ethan wasn't the quiet mechanic people saw now. He had been full of ambition, running a small but rapidly growing startup, dreaming of a future where he could give his family everything they deserved. His wife, Emma, had been his anchor, warm, supportive, and always believing in him, even when things felt uncertain. That night, they had been driving home late after celebrating a small milestone for his business. The roads were slick from rain, the kind that made headlights blur and distances hard to judge. Ethan remembered insisting on taking a faster route, brushing off Emma's gentle concern with a confident smile. He thought he was in control. He thought he had time. Then came the moment he could never escape. The sudden glare of another vehicle, the screech of tires, the violent impact that shattered everything in an instant. The world had spun, twisted, and gone silent. When Ethan woke up in the hospital, the first thing he felt wasn't pain, it was absence. Emma was gone, just like that. And no matter how many people told him it wasn't his fault, Ethan never believed them. In his mind, every decision he made that night led to that moment. If he had chosen a different road, if he had listened, if he had been more careful, she would still be alive. That belief became his punishment. He shut down his business, withdrew from everyone who had once been part of his life, and chose a path that felt smaller, safer, like he no longer deserved anything more. The only thing he held on to was Lily, who had been too young to understand what they had lost, but old enough to need him. And so Ethan became everything for her, while quietly erasing everything for himself. Now, lying in the darkness, Claire's question forced him to confront what he had been avoiding all along. It wasn't just that he believed he didn't deserve happiness, it was that he had been living as if feeling anything beyond survival was a betrayal of the past. But for the first time in years, something inside him felt unsettled, not just pain, but doubt, and that frightened him more than anything else. Claire Whitmore had built her reputation on knowing everything that mattered before anyone else did, but nothing in her years of success had prepared her for the weight she now carried after learning the truth about Ethan Cole. What had started as curiosity had quietly turned into something far more personal, something she could no longer ignore. She had asked a trusted assistant to look into Ethan's past, expecting to uncover a simple story, maybe financial struggles, maybe a failed business, but what came back was something that left her sitting in stunned silence in her office. The report was detailed, clinical, and unemotional, yet every line felt heavy. 4 years ago, a fatal car accident had taken the life of Ethan's wife. The vehicle involved had been part of a production line connected to one of Claire's company's subsidiaries. At the time, there had been internal pressure to push the model to market quickly, despite minor safety concerns flagged during testing. The issue had been marked as low risk, signed off, and buried beneath layers of corporate urgency. Claire had never personally reviewed that case. It had been just another file in a sea of decisions made in the pursuit of growth. But now, reading it with Ethan's face in her mind, it wasn't just a report anymore. It was a human story. His story. The realization hit her slowly but deeply. Her company, her success, had been tied to the worst moment of his life. Claire felt something unfamiliar tightening in her chest. Guilt. Real, undeniable guilt. For the first time, her power felt meaningless. All the control she had built over her world couldn't undo what had already happened. She found herself replaying every interaction she'd had with Ethan, the way he spoke so carefully, the quiet heaviness in his eyes, the way he seemed to carry something invisible yet crushing. And now she understood why. The man she had begun to care about had lost everything, and in some distant, indirect way, she was connected to that loss. The thought made it difficult to breathe. Over the next few days, Claire became distant, even from her own work. Meetings blurred together, conversations felt empty, and decisions that once came easily now carried a strange hesitation. Her mind kept returning to the same question: does he deserve to know? And more importantly, would telling him destroy everything? Because somewhere along the way, this wasn't just about curiosity anymore. She had started to see Ethan not as a mystery to solve, but as someone who mattered to her. That realization made the situation even more complicated. If she told him the truth, she risked losing the fragile connection they had built, the quiet trust, the moments of understanding, the small glimpses of warmth he had begun to show. But if she stayed silent, she would be building something real on top of a lie, and Claire knew better than anyone how fragile that kind of foundation could be. One evening, she stood by her window, looking toward Ethan's small house next door. The lights were on, and she could faintly see Lily moving around inside, her laughter carrying softly through the still air. Ethan's silhouette appeared for a moment, steady and familiar, yet now burdened by a truth he didn't know. Claire's hand tightened slightly at her side as the weight of her decision settled in. For the first time in her life, she wasn't thinking like a CEO calculating risk. She was thinking like a person who might lose someone important. And no matter which choice she made, she knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The evening Claire chose to tell Ethan the truth felt heavier than any boardroom decision she had ever made. There were no advisors, no strategies, no safe outcomes. Just a quiet street, a small house, and a truth that could break everything. She walked up to his door slowly, her heart unsteady in a way she had never experienced before. When Ethan opened the door, he immediately sensed something was different. Claire's usual composure was gone, replaced by a quiet vulnerability that made him step aside without a word. Inside, Lily was already asleep, the house calm and dimly lit, the kind of peaceful silence that made what was coming feel even more overwhelming. They sat across from each other, and for a moment neither spoke. Claire finally broke the silence, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "There's something you need to know." Ethan felt a subtle tension rise in his chest, the kind that comes before something changes forever. As Claire explained, slowly and carefully, the connection between her company and the accident began to unfold. Each word landed like a weight, pressing down on the fragile balance Ethan had spent years maintaining. When she finished, the room fell completely still. Ethan didn't react immediately. He just sat there, staring at the floor, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. Then the emotions came, not all at once, but in waves: anger, pain, disbelief, and something deeper he couldn't even name. "So all this time," he finally said, his voice low and strained, "you knew?" Claire shook her head quickly, tears forming in her eyes. "No, I didn't know until recently, and when I found out, I didn't know how to tell you." Ethan stood up, pacing the room as the memories he had fought so hard to bury came rushing back. The accident, the hospital, the emptiness that followed. For a moment, it felt like he was right back there, reliving everything he had tried to escape. Claire watched him, her heart breaking with every step he took, knowing she had brought this pain back into his life. "You should go," Ethan said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Claire hesitated, as if hoping he might say something else, but he didn't. With nothing left to hold on to, she walked out, the door closing softly behind her. The silence that followed felt louder than anything before it. That night, Ethan sat alone in the darkness, his thoughts spiraling. It would have been easier to hold on to anger, to blame Claire, to retreat back into the life he had built around pain. But as the hours passed, something began to shift. He thought about Lily, about the kind of life he wanted her to see, about the example he was setting by holding on to guilt and shutting himself off from the world. And then he thought about Claire, not as a CEO, not as someone connected to his past, but as the person who had seen through his walls and asked the one question no one else had dared to ask. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to see the truth clearly. The accident had taken everything from him, but it hadn't taken his ability to choose what came next. The next morning, as the sun rose over the quiet neighborhood, Ethan stepped outside, his eyes tired but his expression different, lighter somehow. He walked next door and knocked on Claire's door. When she opened it, surprised and uncertain, Ethan looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "I can't change what happened," he said, his voice steady, "but I don't want to live like this anymore." Claire's eyes filled with emotion as she listened. "I don't know what this is yet," he continued, "but I'm willing to try, if you are." In that moment, something fragile but real began to take shape, not built on perfection or the absence of pain, but on honesty, forgiveness, and the courage to move forward. And for the first time in 4 years, Ethan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved a second chance at happiness. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us on Drew Daily Stories for more powerful emotional journeys that stay with you long after the video ends.